Hello everyone, my name is Hannah and the name of my presentation today is It's My Normal, a linguistic analysis of in and out group perceptions of PTSD in young adults. This is a project that I started for my applied linguistics class this past fall with Professor Ramanathan in the linguistics department, exploring the perceptions that young adults with and without PTSD have of the PTSD healing process. And today I'll be presenting the results of the pilot study that I conducted for this class, as well as talking about future directions that I'd like to take this work. So first, let me just quickly go over what I'll be presenting today. The first thing I'll do is introduce my research question, and then I'll briefly go over what PTSD is and talk about some background for my research. And then I'll get into the data I used and how I collected it. And then finally, I'll get to my results, and I'll leave you with some conclusions and talk about future directions. So first, for my research question. The question that guided this pilot study was, to what extent do participants with and without PTSD agree on both the definition of PTSD and the definition of healing from it? And how is this indicated through their language use? So before I get into the actual research though, I want to briefly go over what PTSD is so we're all on the same page. PTSD stands for post-traumatic stress disorder, and it can develop after someone undergoes or witnesses a traumatic event or a number of traumatic events over time. One misconception that I think is becoming less common now is that this is something that only people who are veterans can experience. This isn't true. PTSD can develop for any number of reasons, from war to domestic violence to childhood abuse to car accidents, and can affect anyone regardless of age, gender, race, or background. The U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs estimates that PTSD will affect about 8% of the U.S. population in their lives. Some common symptoms of PTSD are flashbacks, hypervigilance, nightmares, dissociation, which is feeling disconnected from your body or what's going on around you, and feelings of isolation. And finally, it is a treatable disorder, but it usually requires professional help to recover from. So now that we're on the same page about PTSD, let's talk about how linguistics factors into this. The first concept that I want to introduce you to is that of a meta-message. A meta-message communicates information about the relationship between the speaker and the listener, or something the speaker is talking about, but it isn't explicitly communicated. So meta-messages are basically opinions that a speaker holds that aren't explicitly stated. But they are visible when you look at things like context, sentence structure, and word choice. And often they serve to communicate boundaries between groups or membership in one group or another, which is part of what makes them valuable in this research. And the second concept that I want to introduce you to is this idea of recontextualization, which is the process of taking a word from one context and using it in another, producing a change in the word's meaning. This change might be small or it might be significant, depending on the use. And this is an important concept for this project because research on the perception of pain has found that the meaning someone assigns their pain plays a role in how they experience it. Past work has also found that when survivors of childhood sexual assault recontextualize their trauma, it has a healing effect. Now let's talk about the data I collected and how I did it. This was a pilot study, so I only had 6 participants, consisting of myself and 5 close friends. 3 of the participants were diagnosed with PTSD, and I'll be referring to them as the in-group from here on out. The other group were not diagnosed with PTSD, and I'll be referring to them as the Outgroup. 4 of the participants identified as female, 1 as male, and 1 as non-binary at the time of the study. They were all between the ages of 20 and 26, and I asked all of them the exact same set of 8 questions, designed to measure their perceptions about PTSD and recovery. The interviews ranged from 12 to 45 minutes long, and they were all recorded on my phone before being manually transcribed afterwards. After I recorded and transcribed the interviews, I went through and manually analyzed them. The first part of this was looking for common words and themes across all 6 transcripts, and especially being on the lookout for meta-messages. And then I turned to looking for similarities within the groups and patterns across the groups as a whole, especially things that could differentiate between the groups. Most of the analysis I did for this was looking at the sentence and word level, but I did also look at some of what we call prosodic features, like pauses in speech as well. And now for the fun part, what I found. The first thing that stood out to me as a difference between the groups was how they talked about the concept of normalcy. The in-group members showed a mixture of describing themselves as normal or not, corresponding to how they felt in the situation they were describing. When describing a situation that they were comfortable in or a symptom that they felt they knew how to handle, they were more likely to use the word normal to describe themselves. But when describing a situation where their PTSD still causes them to struggle, they tended to describe themselves as abnormal. The outgroup was much more consistent with their use of the word normal and always contrasted people with PTSD with normal people. This contrast was shown implicitly through meta messages. It's not that they explicitly described people with PTSD as weird or abnormal, it's that they talked about normal functioning or normalcy, and then they talked about having PTSD as a contrast to that. So here we just have some sample quotes to show this. In the first one here, the participant says, "It's just like hard to function normally, I guess. And I don't know how normal is supposed to be," highlighting their struggles with PTSD. Then in this quote, participant A is talking about how she's overcome a lot of her struggles with PTSD, saying, "But, you know, it's my normal." This is describing how now that she's learned to deal with the symptoms, the meaning of normal has kind of changed for her. And finally, here you can see participant D, who's in the outgroup, saying, "I think that's one of the most difficult things with PTSD, is just trying to live a normal life," focusing on the difference between normalcy and PTSD. Another big difference between the groups was their description of the symptoms of PTSD. The in-group used very specific examples and stories to share what symptoms they most struggled with. They also focused on internal problems like feeling out of control or losing agency. So for example, in this quote, participant B says, "The best way to describe it would be like a feeling of uncertainty or like you're not on stable ground." The outgroup, on the other hand, used keywords and general descriptions to describe symptoms and their struggles associated with PTSD. When asked about the biggest struggles associated with PTSD, they also described things like being perceived as different, weird, or misunderstood by other people. You can see this contrast in this quote from participant D's answer to this question. "I do think that one of the biggest challenges is isolation and feeling like your experience is unique." Here she's focusing more on the relationships with others than internal struggles, like you see in participant B's quote. So now that I've talked about the whole study and walked you through my results, what exactly can we take away from it? First and foremost, I think it's important to talk about what we can't take away from this. This was a very small pilot study, consisting of only 6 people, and they were all from the same friend group, so everyone had some personal connection to PTSD. No one was completely divorced from it. The in-group demographics especially were very similar, making it dangerous to assume that commonalities in their responses were only because they had PTSD. They could easily be for other reasons. And finally, 2 of the 3 outgroup members had taken classes that covered PTSD before, which could have shaped their perceptions. As a pilot study, this wasn't meant to produce definitive results, but to explore this area and refine questions for future research. None of these results are definitive, but they can point towards directions to explore further. And the first thing these results suggest is that the recontextualization of normal may be a part of the healing process for people with PTSD. And they definitely highlight a slight but important difference between how those 2 groups think about recovery. For the in-group, it appears that recovery means recontextualizing the meaning of normal to meet them where they are in their stage of recovery. Whereas for the outgroup, recovery appears to mean that the person with PTSD changes their behaviors over time to return to a baseline. There's also a mismatch in the level of detail both groups use to describe struggles, with the in-group being more precise and detailed, and the outgroup being more vague. However, the outgroup did acknowledge this as another potential difficulty of PTSD, talking about not being understood as one of the struggles that people with PTSD can go through. In future, I would love to add clinicians as a third group to see how their perceptions of PTSD and recovery compare to members of the in and out groups. Of course, I would also expand the study size in future so that these results could be interpreted more definitively. I would also include questions in the interview that specifically target the use of normal, now that we have some results from this pilot study suggesting that it could be an important part of the perception of recovery. And I'd also like to include more questions about what shaped Outgroup members' perceptions of PTSD. Finally, I'd like to thank my study participants for their time and insight in their interviews. And I'd especially like to thank Professor Ramanathan and Peter Torres for everything they taught me in class and all of their help in designing and conducting this study. It wouldn't have been possible without any of you. Thank you all for watching. Here are my references, and please comment with any questions.